hand over to you now.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you for letting me take you all back to the early Middle Ages. So the project I'm going to talk about, FeedSax, it is an ERC-funded project, and as is the way of these things, it consists really of quite a large team of people from Oxford and from Leicester. The team includes quite a few archaeological scientists, and I should just declare that I am not a scientist, so the scientific results I'll be presenting are very much the work of some of the people that I hope by now you can see before you on the screen. I think there's a lag of about 10 seconds between each of my slides, so this is going to be an interesting.
Actually, it seems to be working so far. So
fabulous, good, excellent, good. So FeedSax is nearing the end of its 4th year, so this is really a fantastic time to be able to present our results to a somewhat wider audience. So thank you very much. I am, of course, going to start with a little bit of background to the project, then set out the approaches that we're using to analyze our material, and then hopefully spend more or less the second half of the talk presenting some of our results. So I thought I would actually start with this book that was published in 2017, because the author, who's not an archaeologist, he's a political scientist, argues in it for a direct link between cereal farming, wealth disparities, and the rise of states. Scott's focus is on the Neolithic, but his general thesis, not an entirely original one, is that in the past, as cereal farming, cereal cultivation increased, so too did wealth disparities. Now, in fact, medieval Europe is an obvious example of this, although it's not one that is mentioned in the book. The period between about 800 to 1200 AD saw the advent in Europe of new forms of cereal farming that enabled landowners to amass considerable wealth by exploiting the labor of others. In England, from about the 10th century onwards, kings granted relatively small land units to local lords, so that by the time of the Norman conquest in 1066, there were thousands of such landowners with their own estates, prospering from the rents extracted from peasants who worked the land. It was the expansion of cereal farming that made this possible. So this is a quote from Scott. "The key to the nexus between grains and states lies in the fact that only cereal grains can serve as a basis for taxation." And what I think he means by this is that cereals possess certain qualities that make them an ideal medium for tax and rent collectors. So they're harvested at predictable points in the year, they're easily stored, easily transported, divided up, measured, and so on. So medieval landowners could enrich themselves more readily from land sown with cereals than anything else. Now, cereals are not only easily taxed, but a land unit sown with cereals will feed many more mouths than the same land unit used to graze livestock. Of course, that's still true today. So the cerealization of the countryside fueled a period of exceptionally steep population growth, as well as the expansion of towns and markets. Now, this slide throws some figures out there which are all, contestable and can be argued over, but they give you a sense of just how steep that demographic curve was. Now, the aim of FeedSax is to generate direct evidence for this expansion of cereal farming by analyzing plant and animal remains from archaeological contexts. Our focus has been very much on England. I should just mention that we do have a sort of side project on the Rhineland, which I'd love to tell you about, but unfortunately, I don't think there's going to be time. So the focus today is going to be on the English material. So how did medieval farmers increase cereal production so dramatically? Well, in many parts of the country, although by no means all, this was achieved by open field farming, especially the type known as 2 or 3 field farming, or sometimes common field farming. So this is a situation in which most or all of a community's arable lay in 2 or more large unenclosed fields, and where the holdings of individual farmers took the form of strips within those fields that would be intermingled with those of their neighbors. Now, the spread of this type of farming has been described by some historians as an agricultural revolution. It was believed that open field farming, together with the spread of the moldboard plow, underpinned the Carolingian economy and shifted prosperity from southern Europe, from the Mediterranean, to the north. Now, these views have been rightly criticized over many decades as technological determinism, and there are, of course, also many problems with the term revolution. But there is no question that the spread of the moldboard plow and of open fields was one of the transformative changes of the Middle Ages. Now, historians have been interested in the origins of open fields for well over a century now, ever since the historian Seebohm argued that they were inextricably linked with the emergence of what he called the English village community, living in what is generally referred to as a nucleated village. And the image here in the lower right is what we are talking about. So closely spaced, sort of contiguous farmhouses set amid a large expanse of unenclosed fields. And you see in this image these so-called ridge and furrow earthworks, which are kind of the fossilized remains, the results of the actions of a moldboard plow. Written sources demonstrate that in England, open fields and nucleated villages like this one date back at least to the 12th century. And indeed, you can still walk through such villages and through such landscapes today, especially in the Midland counties. Medieval and later documents also tell us that a key feature of open field farming was communal management and collective decision-making. For the system to work, farmers had to follow an agreed scheme of crop rotation and share expensive resources. So the plow and the team of oxen needed to pull it. The theory goes that in some parts of the country, the need to share plow teams encouraged households to live in close proximity. So according to this view, the village is effectively a byproduct of a certain type of cereal farming. So changes in cereal farming not only changed parts of the landscape, but also the social geography in many parts of Europe, including England. Now, before we go further, it's just worth pausing to think about what it is that open fields replaced. And the truth is, nobody knows exactly, but the assumption is that once the demands of the Roman state for taxes and for rents disappeared in the 5th century, the overall amount of arable land decreased, and the emphasis on arable production decreased. So cereal farming in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, we imagine, involved intensive cultivation, small-scale cultivation of small enclosed individual holdings. So land would have been cultivated using spades and ards, a scratch plow, not pulled by human beings, I have to say, pulled by oxen, on light, easily tilled, but relatively poor soils. And I guess the point to make about this is that farmers working in this way would tend not to produce large, regular surpluses. But then again, they wouldn't need to. So going back to the origins of open fields. These have been hotly debated now for, as I said, well over a century. And that debate is still alive and well. I put these books up simply to make the point that there's still a lot of work and debate going on in this, about this question. These books all appeared within about 18 months of each other. But there's still no agreement or consensus about certain fundamental questions, like, was there an agricultural revolution, or was there instead a sort of gradual process of serialization? Were the changes that we see in farming in this period a response to top-down pressures from greedy lords demanding ever larger surpluses, or was it essentially bottom-up and evidence of peasant agency, and so on? So some really fundamental big questions remain unresolved. So after more than a century of research, we have, I would argue, reached an impasse. Why can't we agree? Well, essentially because we still lack direct, closely dated evidence for early medieval fields themselves and for the conditions in which crops were grown. And the evidence we do have is capable of being read in a variety of different ways. So what we desperately need is new data. And that is essentially what FeedSax is trying to do, is doing. as to generate direct evidence of farming regimes in this period. So that brings me on to our methods, our approaches to reconstructing those regimes. Our primary evidence takes a number of different forms. First of all, and in some ways most significantly, we have medieval cereal grains themselves, preserved through accidental charring. And what we can learn from those, in addition to actually identifying the crops themselves, is we can look at the isotopic signatures of those grains, which reflect the conditions in which the cereals were grown. How intensively they were manured, whether they were grown in rotation with each other, whether they were grown on light, dry soils or relatively heavier, wetter soils. And then we can compare those results with the evidence of arable weed seeds. So the weeds that grew in amongst the crops also vary according to soil conditions, the season when the crops were sown. So the weeds that would grow in a field that was autumn sown would be different from those that would grow in a field that was sown in the spring, and so on. So we have the arable weed seeds, and we have animal bones. In particular, I'll be talking today mostly about cattle bones, because cattle that pulled a heavy plow were more likely to develop certain deformities in their feet. And that's something we can use to trace the spread of the use of the plow. And finally, we're looking at pollen. So pollen, of course, provides us with the big picture of land use. And in particular, something we're very interested in is using pollen to try and trace the extent to which arable expanded in this period at the expense of pasture and heath. So those are our primary source materials. They are, of course, all organic, which creates all sorts of problems in terms of preservation, but it does have one great advantage, which is that they can be radiocarbon dated, and that provides us with a really robust chronological framework, and that also provides considerable precision. So by taking a multi-proxy approach, we are trying to distinguish between cereals that were grown in, and I'll explain this terminology in a moment, but grown in extensive low input systems, of which open field farming is one, and those that were grown using other sorts of cultivation strategies, more intensive, smaller scale strategies. First, I just want to say something about where our data come from. Well, we have analyzed material from 10 case study sites that you see here on this map in considerable detail, but we have, in addition, a very large national database, as you can see there, of archaeobotanical samples, animal bones, and so on. But one thing that must be said is, and will be apparent, I think, from this map, is that most of our material comes from parts of the country that were heavily dominated by open fields. We would have liked to get more material, for example, from the north, from upland sites, and so on. But the reality is that the best preserved samples come from that central zone, which is the open field zone. So we don't perhaps have as much regional variability as we would ideally have liked. And also, before talking about our results, I just want to mention that the modern baseline for the medieval weed and stable isotope data came from botanical surveys carried out by my colleagues on the FeedSax project at the open field village of Laxton in Nottinghamshire, and also from the organic cereal farm at Highgrove. I partly show this because I just think the slides are so nice, but we need a modern baseline, of course, and this is partly how we obtained it. So on to the analysis. As a kind of framing device, we've introduced the idea of the Moldboard plow package, consisting of three key elements of early medieval farming, namely crop rotation, systematic crop rotation, extensification, which I'll explain in a moment, and use of the heavy Moldboard plow. So taking those in order, crop rotation, many of you will be familiar with this. Collective decisions about crop rotation and fallow grazing were a fundamental feature of open field systems. Different sowing times, so for example, wheat sown in autumn, barley sown in spring, would be reflected in the kinds of weeds associated with those crops. Then the carbon and nitrogen isotope ratios in the grains themselves would indicate whether these different cereals had been grown in the same conditions, so potentially in rotation with each other, or in different conditions, and therefore definitely in different fields, and certainly not in rotation. Extensification or low input farming is the next thing I want to explain. And to do that, I've nicked Amy Bogard's slide. So extensification is a way of increasing output by cultivating more land while investing less input, namely manure and human labor, per land unit. So open field farming is an example of a highly extensive or land extensive system as opposed to a labor intensive system. So in an open field system, fertility was maintained not by intensive manuring, but rather by regular short fallow periods during which sheep grazed on the fallow, helping to restore the fertility with their droppings. So we can think of it as this sort of intensive extensive axis, as you see on Amy's slide here. And then we have the widespread adoption of the moldboard plow. The heavy plow famously turned over the soil, enabling farmers to cultivate heavier, more fertile, more productive soils. But the strain of pulling a heavy plow would cause parts of the skeleton of plow oxen, certainly if they were used consistently over a number of years, to degenerate in various ways. Now, we know that the moldboard plow was already present in England as early as the 7th century, and we know that because of the discovery of this coulter from a site called Lyminge in Kent, which was a royal site, a royal monastery by the later 7th century. So we know it was there, but we also know that by the time of the Norman Conquest in 1066, there were tens of thousands of these moldboard plows in operation. So the question is, when did it change from being kind of rarefied, high-status technology, maybe used in royal monasteries, to something that was much more widely used? So the frequency of those cattle foot pathologies, and also looking at levels of soil disturbance indicated by arable weeds, is helping us address that question. So the central question, in a way, is were crop rotation, extensification, and use of the moldboard plow inextricably linked as kind of traditionally assumed, or did they follow different trajectories? So will we find a revolution, a moment in time when everything changed, evolution, a sort of gradual process, or something messier? And spoiler alert, get ready for some mess. And that brings us on to then results. So I think to talk about farming, we need to talk about farms. So rural settlement in early medieval England underwent three distinct episodes of change, each with its own implications for farming. So we can see changes in the layouts and appearance of the settlements that we excavate. And the first of those three key periods that I want to talk about is what's sometimes referred to as the long 8th century. So this is a period when we see, for the first time since the Roman period, droveways, livestock enclosures, paddocks, corrals, pens, and so on. The first post-Roman hay meadows, as we'll see in a moment, crop storage and crop processing facilities. So that has, the appearance of these features has several implications. First of all, the appearance of droveways and livestock enclosures has, I think, two important implications. First of all, that livestock were now being managed in new ways that required their movement to be controlled so that they didn't stray into farmsteads and into fields. And secondly, that farmers were cooperating, they were pooling labor in order to construct these sometimes very extensive systems of ditched and banked enclosures, and sometimes kilometers worth of these ditches. So these were large-scale undertakings, and we simply don't see them in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries. In the same period, as I mentioned, we see the appearance of the first centralized crop processing and storage facilities since the Roman period, so real investment in infrastructure. So not only grain dryers and malting ovens, but also water mills. We even find a few barns. So these are capital projects, you could call them, associated with high status settlements. So they're tangible signs of the wealth generated by the very cereal surpluses they're designed to store and to process. So all these innovations taken together provide, I think, a compelling and circumstantial case for a transformation of farming during the long 8th century. So what does our analysis of the bioarchaeological remains reveal? And actually, there's an awful lot I could say, but I've just picked out two, I suppose, findings to present since we have such limited time, but I think they're quite telling. The first is that this is when the first large deposits of medieval charred grains appear. Now, why is that important? I think probably because they are likely to reflect larger harvests that are being stored and processed in new ways. It's difficult to prove that, but their sudden appearance, I think, is suggestive of new systems for storing, processing grain that results in accidental burning, charring. So as such, those dumps of charred grain in themselves can serve as prima facie evidence for an increasing emphasis on surplus, larger scale surplus production. And secondly, very importantly, the arable weeds from this period reflect a shift from relatively small scale intensive farming to low input, larger scale regimes. And this is really based on the work of my colleague Amy Bogart, so I'm going to try in my own inexpert way to explain what it is she's done. So this is her image, her slide, which sets out this functional ecological approach to looking at weeds. And it shows how the different attributes of weeds reflect their preferred growing conditions. So the image on the lower right of the slide shows the kind of weed that thrives in high input, high fertility, high, intensively manured conditions. So quite fast growing, tall, broad leaves, and so on. Whereas the image on the lower left-hand side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but anyway, the lower left-hand side shows you the type of weeds that like, conversely, low fertility, extensive, low input conditions. So low growing, narrow leaves, quite small. And then Amy has produced this discriminant function analysis. And the thing to remember, if you're not used to looking at this sort of thing, that the symbols to the right-hand side of the discriminant function analysis reflect weed samples that grow in high input, intensively manured conditions, and those on the left reflect low input, extensive conditions. So if you just remember that, high input to the right, low input to the left, we can look at some actual medieval examples. In fact, only one. So please, we're just going to look at the top part of the slide, the graph that says Stratton, which is a site in Bedfordshire near Biggleswade. Stratton's a really good example because unusually it produced not only later medieval samples, but it also produced 3 early samples dated to between the 5th and the 7th centuries. And they are, I hope you can see easily enough, the 3 white squares. And you will see that they are over to the right hand, or at least relatively speaking, at the right hand, more intensive end of this scale. Whereas by the time you get to what we've called phase 4 here, the black diamonds, in fact, the long 8th century, there's already been a shift to the left, to lower input conditions. And that drift to the left continues through to the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. So there's a progressive shift to ever lower input, more extensive conditions. And we see that not only at Stratton, but we see it repeated at many of our sites. So we can see that that shift to low input occurs in the long 8th century. So true extensification began in that period. The second, I suppose, episode of change that seems to me to be really significant happened in the 10th century. And that's when we get the appearance of the first distinctive aristocratic settlements, some people have called proto-manors. So these are the residences of those local landowners that I was talking about. Now, so far, we can say that we do see some changes in the 10th century in the bioarchaeological records, where the first really good evidence, really solid evidence we have for systematic crop rotation dates to the 10th century. The archaeobotanical evidence also indicates that the 10th century saw the development of regional trends towards crop specialization. So, for example, bread wheat in the Upper Thames Valley and oats in the southwest. And then from the later 10th century and going into the 11th century, we see an increase in the frequency of cattle foot pathologies, together with a growing proportion of male animals, indicating a sharp increase or a marked increase in the use of cattle for traction, and therefore, presumably, in the use of the Moldboard plow. So that is also something we see in the 10th to 11th centuries. Then the third and final change that we see in rural settlement took place between the late 11th and 13th centuries. This is when nucleated villages began to appear in parts of the country with planned arrangements of contiguous, clearly defined house plots. John Blair has recently described the impact of these villages on the landscape as, and I quote, weightier and more permanent than any since the Roman occupation. Nevertheless, we have so far found nothing to suggest major innovations in farming in this period. Those innovations had, in a sense, already happened. What we do see, however, is the density of charred grains per sample increasing sharply. So density, but also number, implying further increase in the scale of arable production. While analysis of sheep and cattle bones indicates increased numbers of livestock overall. Written sources and scatters of pottery sherds associated with manuring also indicate that in this period, broadly late 11th, 13th centuries, landowners were going to considerable lengths to boost soil fertility by manuring and marling. Whether this was driven primarily by a desire to maximize outputs or by concern over declining fertility, of course, is impossible to say. But we can say something based on the weed ecology, and again here I'm using Amy Bogard's images. The weed ecology of those fields demonstrates that however much farmers may have been manuring, marling, etc., those efforts were insufficient to halt an overall trend, albeit quite a slight one, towards diminishing levels of fertility. However, at the same time, you can see that's the way in this linear regression, you can see a slight but downward trend. So we've got centuries, we've got a timeline along the bottom of the slide, and essentially the intensity, the fertility is declining over time. However, at the same time, we see levels of soil disturbance increasing. So the weed flora are also reflecting more consistent and thorough soil disturbance, in other words, tillage, especially from around the 12th century onwards. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's those data points that are really appearing at the upper end of this analysis. And you can see that particularly from about 1100 onwards, you see quite a concentration of that high disturbance signal. And indeed, those levels of disturbance are comparable to what you find in modern arable fields, which I find remarkable. So we think this probably reflects more systematic use of a moldboard plow within 2- and 3-field systems. So the later 11th to 13th centuries saw, on the one hand, broad continuity of agricultural regimes, but against the backdrop of an increase in the overall scale of arable farming and of growing labor inputs into tillage. So in conclusion, I think we can say now that it's quite clear that no one period saw revolutionary change, although the long 8th century did see significant innovation in crop and animal husbandry practices. Second, if the extensification of cereal farming was initiated by lords, the inhabitants of the proto-manors we talked about earlier, we wouldn't expect to find evidence for it prior to the 10th century. But we do. The weed flora clearly indicate that the shift to low-input cultivation did predate the 10th century, suggesting that the trend towards larger-scale, lower-input cereal farming originated on peasant farms as well as on monasteries and perhaps royal centres, driven presumably by population growth and by the development of the first formal coin-using markets since the Roman period. The appearance of systematic crop rotation, widespread use of the moldboard plough, and the fine-tuning of cropping regimes, however, is consistent with at least some degree of top-down pressure to increase productivity. Our results, in short, indicate that the different elements of the moldboard plough package did not come together in a single revolutionary moment, in a big bang, or indeed follow a single shared trajectory, but rather that the serialization of England was a centuries-long process, but one that was punctuated by periods of innovation and more rapid change. And I'll finish there. Thank you, and also, of course, thanks to the whole FeedSax team.